Good afternoon and glory to Ukraine.
Glory to the heroes.
I am Ole Krishtopa, and this is a History for Adults. With this episode, we are starting a long overdue series, History of Ukraine for Adults. Thanks to the Renaissance Foundation for support. Why did we do this? Because harsh life experience shows that each of us should know who we are and where we came from. Otherwise, some mongrel will come and assure us that we were created in a secret laboratory, either by the Austrian General Staff or by Vladimir Lenin, and they will kill us so that there is no one to claim the opposite. And there is also a world that doesn't know about us or doesn't know enough about us. Therefore, we translate these issues into foreign languages for those who need to see how medieval Rusʼ became Ukraine and Tartary became Russia. And note bene, we will not try to rewrite Hrushevskyi or outspeak Snyder. In our format, it is simply impossible and not necessary. Another thing is important for us, to look at the history of Ukraine in two most important aspects: what place we have had in the world all this time and why we do not belong in Russia. So, let's go ahead. I mean back in the past. Subscribe to the History for Adults channel, because if our army is now showing how to fight, then history is showing why and with whom. Let's start with the Paleolithic, the ancient Stone Age. About 1 million years ago, the first people, arcanthropes, appeared in Europe. They came from the south, from Africa and the Middle East, and already knew how to use stone tools and fire. They looked like this. At the same time, they appeared in Ukraine, primarily in western Ukraine. The oldest settlement of ancient people in our country was found near the village of Korolevo in Transcarpathia, because, as Jim Morrison said,
"The West is the best."
In fact, this is not the point. People simply followed the melting of the glaciers, or retreated when the glaciers were spreading forward. That is why the first human settlements appeared primarily where it was warmer, in Transcarpathia, Donbas, and Crimea, because the glacier sometimes reached the current city of Dnipro, meaning it covered almost all of Ukraine. It is good that the Black Sea was smaller then, so there were more southern lands. And Crimea was not yet a peninsula. It is scary to think what was happening further in the north, in Russia and Belarus, although now things are peculiar there too.
Putin is the president of the world.
On our territory, meanwhile, human cultures were changing. Neanderthals came instead of arcanthropes, followed by Cro-Magnons, but they all often settled in the same places. In Korolevo alone, 16 archaeological layers were found one on top of the other. That is, people had been living here on a 120-meter hill above the Tisa River literally for millions of years in a row, and are living still. There is another such iconic place in Ukraine, even more symbolic. This is the Kirilliv settlement on the right bank of the Dnipro. Cro-Magnons have lived there since at least the 25th millennium BC. Some believe that even earlier, and they had stayed there for millennia. They were no longer looking for caves. They built dwellings from wood, skins, and bones of large animals, mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, and lions. Now this place is also inhabited. This is the capital of Ukraine, Kyiv. The father of Ukrainian archaeology, Vikenty Kavoyka, was the one who found a settlement. He wasn't allowed to dig up Kyiv completely, but where he could, he also found the settlements of ancient people. For example, in the Protasiv Yar ravine. Now it is a capital ski resort. Over the years, human tools became more and more perfect, and in addition to purely functional changes, they were covered with ornaments and patterns. That is, intangible needs and rituals arise, even if they weren't very complex at first.
But because man did not have the time for complicated rituals, funeral services were often brief.
But everything was changing and developing. In Mizin settlement, even further north in the Chernihiv region, more complex patterns, drawings with ochre, red paint, and figurines of women were found. These are the so-called Paleolithic Venuses, either ideals of beauty or goddesses of fertility. They are found all over Europe, from France to the southern Urals. But there was also something unique. Ukrainian archaeologist Serhiy Bibikov found a whole series of strange bone products decorated with ornaments and with traces of frequent use, but absolutely not practical. Their role was understood only when the scientist guessed to tap them, and these turned out to be percussion instruments. There were a whole lot of them. An orchestra, the oldest in the world. Together with the musicians of the National Symphony Orchestra of Ukraine, the archaeologist even played melodies which could have been created by mammoth hunters from northern Ukraine. Here, listen to The time of hunters for large animals is over. Ancient giants died or followed the glacier. Smaller ones remained, which cannot be caught. So closer to the 10th millennium BC, the ancient people had to invent a bow, the first long-range weapon. There were more and more people on the territory of Ukraine. The number reached hundreds of thousands. Also due to warming, the Black Sea increased to the present size, new rivers appeared, and the glacier left behind a bunch of lakes. So people also learned to fish. The Stone Age in Ukraine ended with the First Revolution.
Glory to Ukraine.
Ukrainians love revolutions. That one was called Neolithic. It was a transition from hunting and gathering to cattle breeding and agriculture. The climate for this has become very attractive as well as a landscape. The current steppes in the southeast were formed, forest steppes in the center, and forests in the north and west. There was a place to graze cattle and to plant a bed and what to build a house from. So on this soil in Ukraine, at the end of the Stone Age and at the beginning of the Copper Age, its own proto-civilization appeared. It was completely different from the classical cradles of civilizations, Mesopotamia, the Levant, and Egypt. But synchronous with them, the same 6-4 millennium BC, and no less interesting. Its founders were probably newcomers from the Balkans who moved through Romania and reached the Dnistro River and Ukraine and joined the local Neolithic cultures. It reached its heyday at the same time when ancient Sumer appeared, about 4,500 years ago. Traces of this civilization were found in the 19th century in 3 countries at once, so it is known by different names. In Romania, it was called Cucuteni, in Austrian Galicia, the culture of painted ceramics, and in the Subrus Ukraine, Tripilia. Archaeologists discovered that at the peak of their development, the Tripilian people occupied a huge territory from the Carpathians to the Dnipro, and from Policia to the Black Sea, where they built more than 2,000 settlements. They already knew the wheel, so they made carts and harnessed oxen to them. This must be the most traditional vehicle on the territory of Ukraine. The people of Tripilia built proto-cities, gigantic settlements of 5, 10, or even 25,000 inhabitants. At that time, these were the largest clusters of people in Europe. The houses had 2 to 3 stories, were located in circles, so that there was no draft and wild animals wouldn't run through. Except for residential settlements, they also built public buildings for the councils or religious gatherings. Defensive walls and towers were not built, so they didn't fight with anyone. Rather, they lured and assimilated their neighbors with their superior standard of living. These almost cities were completely self-sufficient agricultural centers. When the land was exhausted, for 50 years or more, the Tripilian people collectively moved to fresh soil. The buildings were diligently burned, probably by themselves and probably ritually. Probably because we don't know for sure. For some reason, the people of Tripilia did not leave their writing, unlike the Sumerians, although they used complex ornaments and symbols on their exquisite ceramics. In particular, the swastika. Oh, just don't tell Putin, otherwise he will start his mantra again.
A gang of drug addicts and neo-Nazis who settled in Kiev
Why did Sumer and Egypt pass this stage and develop further, but Tripilla disappeared? Why did cities begin to shrink and decline, art and ceramics to become primitive, and the population to assimilate among neighbors and not vice versa? Because, as will happen more than once in Ukrainian history, such neighbors came from the east with whom you can't survive on good terms, but Tripillian people weren't warriors. At that time, Iranian-speaking peoples came to us, wave after wave. They did not build cities, but mounds and idols, and also made weapons from metal, axes, daggers, and tips. We suspect they also burned some of the Tripillian cities. The first of these peoples who arrived, whose name has been preserved in history, the Cimmerians. They are mentioned in Assyrian and ancient Greek chronicles as a warlike tribe that mastered horse riding and iron weapons, and they did damage not only in Ukraine. There was a joke among the Soviet intelligentsia. What city of the USSR is the oldest? Moscow, Kyiv, or Yerevan? Those who will say Moscow is a fool or a party official, who will say Kyiv is a Ukrainian nationalist, and who will say Yerevan is the only one who knows history, because Armenian Yerevan is ancient Erebuni, the capital of one of the first real states in the world, Urartu, and it was also destroyed by the Cimmerians. That's probably why the only Cimmerian left in pop culture is a hefty barbarian with a sword.
The Destroyer.
In Ukraine, the Cimmerians built the first city in our written history, Simmeropolis, on the site of present-day Mykolaiv. Compared to the ancient Tripillian giants, it was a tiny village without village councils, but with protective ramparts and ditches, because you'll never know who'll be passing by. The Scythians came next. They pushed the Cimmerians out to the Crimea and gave our region the first written name, the Great Scythia. That's how the father of history, Herodotus, called it. The country stretched from the Danube in the west to the Don in the east. The ancient Greek historian divided the Scythians into three groups: royal, nomadic, and plowmen. The first ones were obviously the real Scythians, the second, their conquered predecessors, the same Cimmerians, and the third, local farmers on whom the Scythians levied taxes. These nomads left behind not only mounds and stone women, this is how their monumental works were later called in Ukraine. They also left behind Scythian gold, a lot of wonderful jewelry that has become iconic for modern Ukraine. The most prominent, pectoral of the Scythian king.
1150 грамів,
1150 grams, 958 gold, 30 centimeter diameter, about 100 figurines.
одна від одної фігурок.
And they were the first in Ukraine to get tattoos. At least, they are the first we know for sure, thanks to a few mummies of the Scythian kings. Both men and women decorated themselves in this way, probably not just for beauty, but as a reward for military valor.
The Scythian tribes gave rise to the legends of the Amazons.
Because Scythians fought a lot. Take at least a repulsion of Persian invasion in 513 BC. Before attacking the Greeks, King Darius the Great decided to conquer Scythia. He led a huge army to Ukraine, about 800,000 men, according to Herodotus. The Scythians used tactics a la Valery Zaluzhnyi, exchanged space for time. That is, they let the enemy columns deep into the steppes and mercilessly beat them with constant jumps from all sides. After 2 months of such a war, Darius shamefully fled to save himself and the remnants of his army. And at home in Persia, he declared that it was such a gesture of goodwill.
It was decided to regroup combat units and go on a counter-retreat.
After such a debut, the Greeks arrived in Scythia, not on purpose of conquest, but for the sake of trade. Gradually, their coastal colonies turned into city-states, and later united into powerful kingdoms, Bosporus and Pontus. Meanwhile, in the 3rd century BC, the Scythians were forced out by new nomads, Sarmatians. They left a smaller archaeological legacy, however gave us the popular Ukrainian female name, Roxolana, from the name of one of the Sarmatian tribes. And they also gave us beer.
Сарматів не мали жодних шансів перед сильним ворогом. Та попри всі протиріччя, сармати змогли об'єднатися, скріпивши союз напоєм з ячменю та хмелю. Сармат.
Sarmat, together we are strong.
Also, Sarmatian tribes, Roxolans and Rosamons, most likely left behind the key ethnonym for Ukraine, Rusʼ. We will return to this topic in the next series. The Sarmatians also came up with their own cool military trick, dressing in armor not only the rider, but also the horse. This is how heavy shock cavalry appeared, cataphractarius. This is how they were depicted on Trajan's column in Rome. And this in Hollywood. According to many historians and to the plot of Antoine Fuqua's 2004 film, legendary British King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table were actually a detachment of Sarmatian armored cavalry led by its Roman commander. How is this possible? Very simple. You just have to remember how Rome came to Ukraine. In the 1st century BC, the king of the Bosporus kingdom, Mithridates Evpator, occupied the entire coast of the Black Sea, Asia Minor, now Turkey, and clashed with Rome. He was defeated by the Romans and took his own life in his capital, Pantikapaeum. This is the modern city of Kerch in the Ukrainian Crimea. The local mountain still bears the name of the ancient king. Since then, Rome came to the current Ukrainian lands. First, the empire took power over the colonies in the Crimea. In the 2nd century AD, Emperor Trajan captured Dacia, present-day Romania, and approached the Dnistro. Soldiers of the 1st Italian, 5th Macedonian, and 11th Gallic legions visited Tira, today's Bilhorod-Dnistrovsky, and began to recruit Sarmatian cavalrymen for the service of Rome and to frighten enemies with them on all the borders of the empire.
People so brave, so selfless that they cannot be real. Arthur and his knights.
Meanwhile, in Sarmatia, Ukraine, the intensity of changes began to sharply increase. At the beginning of the new millennium, new conquerors came from the west, the Germanic tribes of the Goths. They pushed out of the steppes the remnants of the Sarmatians and made their way to the Crimea. Later, one amateur historian would use it as an argument for his thesis that the peninsula should belong to him because grandfathers fought. We are now talking about Hitler, not his followers. The largest ethnic group in Europe began to form on the territory of present-day Ukraine, the Slavs. Great resettlement of nations temporarily turned the country into a passage yard and retarded development for another century.
Just like in our kindergarten?
But then, little by little, things got better, and a real Third Rome and the Second Jerusalem was born on the banks of the Dnipro. But more about that in the next series. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss anything. And also, remember to put like under this video so that it would be seen by as many people as possible. See you in the next era.